All right, so here are the things we're going to learn today. Drew is going to give us a talk about general APIs, like what are APIs, what are they made out of, how do you set them up in Bildr, etc. And then we're going to kick it over to Mark, who's going to take us through things to look for when you're setting up APIs, like when you're reading docs from the other person you're trying to integrate with, secrets, and he's going to take us through an example with Screenly. There's a lot of custom actions that we have for other integrations, but I think I might have overestimated the time we had to go through this. So we'll see how many we can get to. And then we might get kind of like a teaser related to crypto and NFTs that we are working on. So that's where we're at today. If you guys have any questions along the way, feel free to unmute yourselves and chime in, or just ask us in the chat, and then I'll monitor that as we go and we can answer them. So Drew Thomas, are you ready to teach us APIs 101?
I think so.
Okay.
So I'm actually going to do something a little weird. I have a slide deck, a little weird for Bildr Hour, but I think because like the nature of APIs, I needed to do it. It's really short and simple, but basically I just wanted to set the stage a little of like, more like what is an API? And so first I'll do that and I'll kind of keep it quick, but I would encourage, if you have questions, chat them or shout them, because I don't know what everyone's knowledge is in the room about APIs. I'd be happy to go into any more detail, but basically I'm going to show that and then show like the most simple, basic example of getting an API to work that I could think of, or that we could think of, which is a Zapier webhook. So I'll just do, how to send a Zapier, and you can trigger whatever you want from there. And then after that, Mark will get much more advanced, as far as the rest of the stuff, but I just kind of wanted to set the stage. So let me see if I can get this screen share correct. So you should be able to see my screen. Cool. And I'm just going to dive in. Like I said, just feel free to interrupt or whatever. But to start, what is an API? Because it's kind of vague and not everyone knows. But basically, it's this semi-standard way to send information from one app to another. And that's all it is. Like, it's not doing processing. It's not doing other stuff. You're sending information. You're getting information back. That's what an API is at its core. And the reason I wrote semi-standardized is because there's not actually like an official protocol or an official set of standards, but there's guidelines for how to set up an API. And that's exactly what makes them so hard for people to learn. And to just say like, oh, go use this API, is because it's not actually standardized. So every API that you use, you have to go to their documentation and, see what they want you to do. And they might do stuff a little bit differently than the last API you used, et cetera. That makes it really tricky, but there is kind of this underlying architectural guidelines. So the types of things an API can do, just to also kind of scope this, you can bring data into your project from somewhere else, some other set of data. You can send data from your project out to another app or project so that they can do something with it. Or you can trigger actions, which is like Zapier, and that's like what I would show. And so if you're bringing data in, like an example of that would be if you have an item and you want to get information about it, or if you have like a location in your app and you want to get some Google information about it, you can call out to an API and just supplement your app, basically. And then sending data out would be more like if you want to save something in Airtable, you're going to send some of your data out to Airtable, and Airtable is going to do the processing, but you're just going to send them the data, that kind of thing. Or like adding someone to an email list, you can do that with an API. So they type in their email, you send it to your email provider, and your email provider takes care of it after they receive that data. And then Zapier is like the triggering one, which we'll go through in Bildr. And so this is like super, super simplified of how they work. And actually some of this, if you are really technical, you could argue with me. But without going into all the nuance and all the like true technical, this is what I consider the important stuff. This is what you need to know, which is basically that it's these standardized guidelines for sending information. And 99% of the time in 2021, you're sending information as JSON. And JSON is just like human readable text that every coding language can use. Basically, it's language agnostic text. But technically, APIs can be like all kinds of other stuff too. It used to be really common to see them in XML, but these days it's almost all JSON. Second thing is you'll see this term REST or RESTful. And that's just the name for like the modern APIs are almost all REST APIs. And that REST, I actually forget what the RE stands for, but it's like stateless transfer. It's just like describing the way that these APIs work. You don't have to care at all about REST or what it means, but you're going to see it. So just so you know, that's just the name of this kind of API. And then the third thing is that any app can make an API request to any other app. That's the beauty of it. That's the point of APIs. It doesn't matter if one's in one coding language, the other's in another coding language. It doesn't matter if one's a website, one's an app. The point of APIs is that you're sending information and receiving information amongst anything. And then lastly, just to kind of drive in that point that you're not actually, APIs aren't doing anything but sending information. So when you send stuff to some other app, they might process that or they might store that information. They might do stuff with it, but that's outside of the API. The API is just sending and then receiving. And then so to get like a little technical, and this is important. So when you go to use an API, you don't have to know all the technical stuff, especially in Bildr. You don't really have to know all the technical stuff behind it, but you do need to know these components of an API call because every API call is going to have some form of these components. And when you look in that documentation, they're going to assume that you know all this. They're going to assume you understand like the anatomy of an API call. So just want to go through, there's kind of 6 things I highlighted here. So these are the first 3. The method, which is like get, post, put, patch, delete, options. There's more of them than what I wrote here. That's just one of the components, and it kind of just tells the API what you're intending to do. So like a get would list information traditionally, a post would be like sending information to create a record, for example. And again, these are totally loose, like nothing like, someone who makes an API, they can say, you have to send a post method to list these items. They can say that if they want. So these are just very loose guidelines, but you have to look in the documentation to actually know what an API requires, what they're looking for, that kind of thing. And then the URL endpoint, which is every API request has an endpoint. Just like every website has a URL, every API request has a URL. And so they're unique. And that's how the API, the app that's receiving your request, they're going to do something based on that URL and the method. And so one API, we call things an API. It could be like a million endpoints. It could be like 20 endpoints, one endpoint, a million endpoints that makes up an API. Each one's going to do something different. And each one's going to potentially do different things based on this method. That's why the method's important. And then lastly, I just made a note that sometimes the API URL, you'll actually pass data in the URL itself. So I'm going to go over, there's like really 3 ways to pass data through an API endpoint. One of them is directly in the endpoint itself. And then another method is in URL parameters, which if you know URL parameters on a website, where you write question mark and the key equals value. It's just a way to pass information into a website. You can do that same thing with APIs. You can use URL parameters. They're formatted with this question mark field 1 equals value 1. That's kind of how it looks. And you don't need to know that even in Bildr, but that's a URL parameter. That's just one way to send information to an API. And then the last way will be post body, which I'll talk about in a second. But here are the next 3 sort of like components. Headers is an important component in APIs because they kind of describe some things about the API request. And they're like, I think this is what people have a lot of trouble with when you go to set up an API, because you have to use the headers that are required by that API. You have to look in the documentation, and they might say to specify a content type. They might say to authenticate. So you probably heard API keys. If you're dealing with APIs, in the headers is where you're actually going to authenticate and send an API key. But the way you do that is different for every API. And there's a few standards. So, there's kind of some general ways that a lot of APIs do it. But really, again, you have to look in the documentation and just do everything exactly how they want it. And then post body, like I said, is the last way to send information, which is it's sort of like an additional, you can do key value pairs like in JSON. You can send a base64 encoded image. You can send HTML, you can send text. You can put a lot of things in a post body that you want to send through this API. And really a lot of the times APIs will give you a choice of using URL parameters or post body, and it won't matter which one you use, but sometimes they'll specify, or if it's a post request and they don't want, and it's sensitive information or something, they'll specify like you have to do it in the post body, you have to do it this way. Sometimes people, APIs will actually say, put this in the post body and encrypt it with this, hash it. There's all these requirements. But again, if you understand the concept that the post body is sending info, you just follow their documentation and do it how they want it. And then lastly, every API is going to return a status code. And the reason this is important, the reason it's kind of highlighted here is because APIs, they're going to return data to you, but that data is open formatted. It's JSON usually, or it's XML, but there's no standard. It can be any format. It can be a huge nested JSON object. It can be an array of JSON objects. It can be a single string value that it returns. They can return anything. And you kind of like look in their documentation, you see what's expected to return, you handle that in your app. But one thing they do consistently is they return status codes. So you can actually know that anything in the 200s status code is a successful response. And then there's a ton. I just listed some examples, but like 401 would mean you're not authorized, your API key is not valid. 404 means that the endpoint isn't found, or maybe the record isn't found. So with these codes, your app can kind of like know how to handle a request, no matter what the request actually says or what is returned in the request. And I made a little note here too that a single API endpoint, if it returns success, like a 200 response, it might have a certain JSON setup, a certain amount of fields it returns. That same endpoint can return a 400, which is an error, and it can have a totally different set of JSON. So it might describe the error message that in the response to you, and you can use that. But not all APIs do that. But all APIs will return the actual status code for your error message. So yeah, hopefully that wasn't too much. That's kind of setting the stage. That's what I got. Now I want to show how that translates into Bildr and becomes very easy knowing those components. And so I don't have the chat open here, but are there any questions I should pause and answer?
Not yet, Drew. And I just chatted a link out to your slides. If anyone was a little late or you want to go back and revisit, that's in the chat.
Yeah, it'd probably help just to skim it too. I didn't want to take too long and harp on any of that. That was actually a little even longer than I planned.
No, it's good. It's good. It's a good refresher.
Yeah. So what I did was taking that knowledge, I set up a very simple project in Bildr to demonstrate this. And what it is it's a webhook in Zapier. To use a webhook API, you're sending nothing basically. You can send information, but you don't have to send information. You just send an API call to an endpoint. And then that endpoint is going to return success or failure or like error, right? So what I did was, and actually before, let me think of the best way to show this. So yeah, before I show this, I'll show you really quickly. In Zapier, I set up a webhook event here. And so that's actually what I'm doing. And you can do this in Zapier, Integromat, Parabola. You can set up webhooks in all these integration programs. But I just chose one called Webhooks by Zapier, which happens to be premium. I pay for Zapier, so I have access. I think Integromat, you can do this for free. And then trigger event, they give you some types. And you can already start to see some of these terms like post, put, get. This one has same post, put, get it can accept, but it's the body, the request body is unparsed. So you can see how it starts to get very technical. But really for this, I just need catch hook. It's just going to wait for a post, put, or get to the Zapier endpoint.
Hey, Drew, real quick, can you tell us what Zapier is for anyone who might not be familiar?
Yeah,
sounds like it's a service that.
Yeah, so Zapier is actually basically like, they call themselves like a no-code API service. But what they do is you create a Zapier account and you can hook up any two applications, two or more, and like run integrations, run automations. And they have, I think at this point, like over 3,000 integrations. So you can basically say, if something happens in, Airtable, do this thing in Webflow or whatever. You can like connect any two, or you can say, if this happens in Airflow, write that record into Google Slides. And you do that. If you use Zapier to do that, you don't have to know anything about APIs. You don't have to know anything about the code. You just set them up in this visual interface. So I'm saying the trigger is a webhook. And then in this case, this isn't even finished out, but the action it would run is create a record in Airtable.
Okay.
And once you set that up, Zapier just works for you. It just listens for that webhook in this case, or if, listen for anything else that you set it up for. And if that event happens, Zapier will do all the processing, do all the hookup for you, and make another thing happen.
Okay, cool.
And this is, I saw a question on Integromat. This is like the exact same thing as Integromat. This exactly works with Integromat. I almost used Integromat, but I actually thought Zapier was a little more common. But yeah, it's the same exact thing. And it's called a webhook. It's exactly the same. And then I saw another question here, is the webhook temporary? No, not in this case. I mean, so in Zapier, I choose webhook, and then it actually gives me this webhook URL right here. That's permanent until I delete this action. So basically this URL is always listening. At any point, any other application can send an API request to this URL. You could actually type this URL in a browser and it would trigger this webhook. It's just like something Zapier is set up to just listen to forever until I delete this app. So what I did to set this up is I chose webhook, and then I came into this trigger and I just click copy here. And now that's the URL endpoint. So that's what I'm going to use in Bildr. So I'll switch back and take a step back and show this action, but that's all I needed to get. That's all the setup I needed to do in Zapier. So I've got a blank page. Basically, it's got a title and a button here. But the important part about this project is I have a flow called trigger Zapier webhook. And this trigger Zapier webhook is one action, which is a fairly new action that we just added to the studio this week. So there'll be some documentation on this specifically. We used to have API actions that were a little different. This is kind of just a new version. It's a little cleaned up. But all it is this API call action that you can come into here and search API right here, and you just drop it into any project, and it will call. It's a universal generic API action. It'll call any API. You can send any parameters, you can send any headers, you can send any post body, and then it'll either set that response into a variable, it can set that response as a value of an element, it's going to return the status code as a variable, and then it's going to run an action if you want on success, or an action on an error. So this API call action does a ton of stuff, and it's very versatile as far as like you can call literally any API. I haven't found an API yet that I couldn't use this action for. So you'll notice in these settings, some of the same terms I went over for those 6 components. So you've got method, and we have some listed here, or you can actually enter a manual method, because some APIs might use a crazy method, but you can do that in here. URL endpoint, URL parameters, the headers, the post body. So it's all in there. And so in this case, that URL that I copied from Zapier right here, that's my URL endpoint. And I know from Zapier's very light documentation here in this that it can wait for a post, a put, or a get request. So that means that actually this method, I could choose get and it would still work. I could choose post and it would work, or I could choose put. And I'm selected on post, but yeah, any of those would work. And really that's the bare minimum that I need to get this API to work. But below, I'll just go over, there's a few more things in the action. So after those initial things I'm sending the method, the URL, the parameters, the headers, and the post body. Then there's some Bildr stuff. So it's saying, how do I want to handle the response? I can either save it as a variable, and I specify the variable below, or I can set it into an element, and now I would select an element here that's changed. 99% of the time, personally, I'm setting it into a variable, because then I can use it more versatilely. I can be more versatile with it. And I can, parse into it with dot notation. I can set part of it in a grid, set part of it as a value, like whatever I need to do. So I'm almost always setting it as a variable, and it defaults to a variable called API response. So after this API call runs, whatever it gives me back, whatever it returns, I'm going to have in a variable called API response. And it's also going to give me a variable called API status code. And so I can use API status code. I could put a condition action after this that says, if the status code is 200, do one thing. If it's 401, do another thing. If it's 404, do another thing. I could get really granular and handle errors and success that way. Or the last thing on here is I can be generic in the way I handle errors and success. And that's what I'm doing in this demo. Basically, I have a flow to run on success. I made a flow called trigger Zapier webhook success. And then a flow to run on error. I made a flow called trigger Zapier webhook error. And all these are, if I go into this success flow, I change the button text, send trigger to success. And for error, I change the button text to error. So that's like a super simple, bare bones way to see. I can get some feedback on whether that API works or didn't work. But if I were doing like a production application, I probably wouldn't actually use these generic ones. I would probably run a condition on the status code and be very explicit. That way I can tell someone if they try to do something in my app, I can tell them you're not authorized versus the endpoint wasn't found. Whereas right now this general one would just say error. So all that leads up to this, where I can click this send trigger button and it's going to send a trigger to Zapier. And if it works, it says success. So my users don't have to know what goes on in the background, but I am able to tell them that it successfully worked. So that's kind of the key. And like in Zapier, I don't have this set up to do anything, but if this were running, it would have just created a record in Airtable. But what I can do, the one extra step I wanted to go on this is right now, this is like an example. So Zapier lets you test the trigger. So it's listening for my trigger. I just ran it. It's saying it found this request, but I didn't send anything. I just sent a request to the webhook. I didn't actually do anything else. So the query string here is blank. There's nothing in it. It just says request. The last thing I wanted to show is if I did want to send information. So if I wanted to say this was my app and I wanted to save a record in Airtable with like name and description, I could come in here to any of the places I mentioned where you send information. So URL parameters is one. I could say name equals Drew. I could say, and I could add more, like.
Hey, Drew, real quick, so you're just manually typing something in here. Should that be an exact match of the field name and builder that you're trying to send?
Well, so if you're doing a webhook, it's wide open. Webhooks will take any format and any form. So this could be something I'm pulling from Bildr. This could be something I'm hard coded. Like this could be anything. So really what I'm doing is I'm setting the name. So these URL parameters are key value pairs. I'm setting the name of the key. In this case, the key is name. In this case, the key is description. And I'll use those in Zapier. So I can write whatever I want for those. It doesn't matter. But when I come into this Airtable one, and again, this isn't even set up, but I would say create new record, update the name field with name from the webhook. So I just have to know what I'm sending so that I can use it. But
so you can kind of match it.
If it were coming from a Bildr collection, which I can send a value from a collection, I can still name the key whatever I want for the webhook. And then from here, instead of coming from text, I'd come from collection or field value or whatever and choose it.
Okay, awesome.
And like if you're doing an API, so if you were calling to the OpenSea API to list an NFT, they might require a specific name here. They might require asset _ ID. So they know which asset to look for, something like that. But for these webhooks, it's open. So I just wanted to show that URL parameters, you can do some, but also post body, you can do different ones. So like post body name, whatever. Whoops. And then because I have those filled out and it's going to send that information, when I make this call, and I'll just refresh so the success comes back. So now I know that was a successful call. I can actually see those in Zapier. So this was the request that it just pulled. You can see it knows now the query string has name Drew, description test, and post body name I filled out as Jim. And so because of that, that's like once you actually do something real with a webhook, you're going to need to be sending it data. Usually, you're not just triggering a webhook randomly. Usually, I would send it like name is Drew, description, test, and then an Airtable. That's maybe that's how my Airtable is set up. So I'd fill out the name and the test and add a new record.
And Cora, the way that I think about those, like the parameters in the body settings, it's basically a mapping. You're saying the key value where you type name and description, that's what the API is expecting on the other side. And then the value you typed in is whatever we're going to send to that. So I'm mapping from my screen to whatever is going to come out on the other end. At least that's how I view it, is always like a mapping.
Okay, cool.
And the way it works once you get into more complicated things in webhooks is sometimes they'll require you to use URL parameters, or like if you use a get method, you have to use URL parameters. Like the post body usually doesn't work, but again, like sometimes people break the standards, and sometimes it might. And whereas like sometimes they might say that the URL parameters are not acceptable and they require you to do something in a post body. So I have the option. I did both because Zapier takes either option, but you might run into a situation with a specific API where you have to actually follow what they say, follow the way they say it. And I mean, I think that's it. Like, I think Mark's going to show more in depth on this stuff. So I don't want to get too crazy, but like with headers, I didn't even talk about them in this one. It defaults to this content type, which most APIs require you to do content type application JSON. That's why we defaulted it, but you can change it if you need to. And authentication would usually come in a header where you might say like, bearer is one way usually when you have a token here. But I think Mark might cover that, so I'm not going to go more in depth there. I think that's pretty much what I wanted to go over as a sort of bare bones example.
Awesome. That was great, Drew. Thank you so much. If anyone has like special resources that you like, I know Peter's been sharing a little bit as far as like things that you like to use for testing or whatnot. Anything that you guys chat, I will include in the resources when I post this recording later in the community. And then, okay, awesome. Mark, looks like you're going to answer his question. Okay, cool. But yeah, if anyone has any residual questions for Drew, just chat them and we can always jump back. And thank you for that awesome slide, Drew. That was fantastic.
Yeah.
That's funny. We were chatting this week. I'm like, how do we show APIs when we know that the room is going to be people who have never looked at APIs before, people who are sort of like intermediate in it, and people who are experts and really want to go into advanced level things. So, well, I guess we just do it all, right? So start from the beginning and go through some middle. So I'm going to go through a little bit more detailed or more in depth, like some of the more complex things and some of the things that you run into when you're dealing with APIs. And as Drew mentioned, every API is different, and you really don't know what you're going to get yourself into until you go look at the API. So the service that Zapier provides or Integromat provides, what they do is they go do a lot of that legwork for you, right? They go in and they say, okay, we're going to create a standard interface that ties to all these other APIs. But a lot of times there's literally millions of APIs that are not listed in any of these other tools. An example of that would be Screenly here, where actually a user posted a support request to us a couple weeks ago saying they're trying to use Screenly and they couldn't get it to work. Like the API just wasn't working, it was returning errors. And so I went and looked at it and I realized the reason it was returning errors was because their documentation is actually incorrect. It's not right. And so when you go look at it, if you go look at how they say to do their requests, so this is similar to what Drew was talking about, where you have a URL that you're sending, you have the headers that you need to send, and you have the content that you need to send. And it's not clear in all APIs exactly how you should send things. Like, should you send them as query string parameters like Drew did there, as a post body as Drew did there? It's just not always clear. So I actually sent a support request to Screenly saying, hey, this isn't working. I'm sending it as a body. in the post body, and here's my request, and here's this is the username I've got, and so you can go look up the API key and kind of see the request, and it was always returning these errors. It turns out that even though they responded and told me, yeah, you need to put it in the post body, I got on a call with Dorian and said, this just isn't working. Something's wrong. Like, what do you think? So someone mentioned in the chat just a moment ago that Postman is a really good way to test APIs. And we totally agree. That's what we use to test APIs. It's way faster than any other method I know of. I think Dorian uses another one called, oh, what is it? Paw, I think.
Oh, yeah, it's for
Paw.
Mac only.
It's Mac only.
Yeah.
So Dorian went in and just started playing with it, and he just had a hunch. He was like, maybe it doesn't want a post body. Maybe it wants the URL, the parameters inside the URL instead, the query string parameters. So he just took a guess at it, and he was right. That's what they were looking for. So the API would never work at all based on their documentation. And not only that, but there's actually 3 different types of documentation for Screenly. There's Screenly.com. There's 3.screenly.com, which is the updated version of the same tool. And then there's also a GitHub repository that has a different set of documentation in it. And all 3 of them have different endpoints, and they're all different options, and there's different responses that come out of each of those. So, and 2 of the 3 are completely wrong. They don't work. So the reason I bring all this up is because it's totally normal when you're dealing with someone else's API to get into it and it just doesn't work, and you can't figure out why. And it's because you're sort of like dependent on this third party to provide you great documentation and great support. And it's really hard to provide great documentation and great support, especially as a small company, especially as, Screenly is a startup, I believe. They're not like a really large entity that has, developers all over the place who can just answer questions. So just to bring that out, like, you might have to do some trial and error here, right? And if you run into something, I'm not sure if everyone in the call today knows, but we actually launched a Discord a week ago today. So we just launched it. It's brand new, but that's probably the fastest way to get support from us right now. So if you have an API you're trying to set up and you can't get it figured out, chat us in the Discord. And then some of these we'll respond with in the way that we responded with Screenly. So let me just kind of go through that. So let's see. I'll go back into the studio. And what I did here was I used Drew's general API action, and I set up the Screenly API in it. So I do some other things beforehand. So like when you click this button, it like hides and shows some things. It sets a response thing. It shows a lottie. It does all this different stuff. Actually, before I dive into that, why don't we just go look at what it looks like? So here's the Screenly demo page that I built, and you type in a URL, you can put a loading delay. So what's really cool about this API, I actually really like this API. It's kind of awesome what it does. You click the button and it goes off and sends a request to their API, and whatever URL you put in there, it actually generates an image, a screenshot in real time of that URL, and then returns it as a path that you can just go retrieve. So you can download it, you can store it, you can do whatever you want to it. So there's the OpenSea.com. So I can just like change this to, builder.com/about or something like that. Click the button again. So you can see my other actions in there. Like when you click the button, I hide the success status and, show some other things. Oh, do we get a fail? Let's see. Maybe we failed in real time. Let's see. But yeah, I think you get the idea there. Oh, there we go. So it goes and generates this image of whatever it is, and you can do really cool settings like changing the delay. And there's a ton of settings in here. So if I go look at their documentation, I can go dive in and see what are all the settings that they have. So you can see these available endpoints, and you can just kind of see all the different options that they have. So this is the kind of thing you're going to be dealing with when you're looking at new APIs. You have to go look at their documentation. Hopefully it's correct, see how it works, and then you have all of these options that are inside of it. So back in the studio, when I'm setting that up, I noticed that on their documentation, it's a post. I noticed that here's the URL. So I copy and pasted that in. I went into the URL parameters and filled out the basic things that were in their documentation. So there's one parameter for URL, another for full page, which wants a 1 or a 0, a delay, which is in a number, but it's a number of milliseconds, and then a window width. And one thing I want to point out here is that some of these I did just like what Drew did, where I put a static text in there. So I said, I want the window width of the screenshot to be 1440 pixels. But some of these other ones, like the delay and the URL, I actually mapped to fields that are on the page here. So that way I can make it dynamic for the user to enter things, and it's going to go run the API based on what the user's doing. So like what Cora mentioned was, maybe I want to pull that from data, right? Maybe this needs to come from the current record of data I'm in and go run the API request for that record of data or something along those lines. So you can think of this as a mapping, map it up however you need to. Same thing with headers. I went and looked at their documentation. They had 3 headers that they wanted: content type. And if I go look at their docs over here, you can see they have content type, accept, and authorization. And note that the authorization, this is probably the most common form I've seen. They're looking for bearer, a space, and then your token. So in this case, I went into Screenly, I signed up for an account. Inside of the dashboard, it lets me generate a token. And when I click the generate token button, it lets me copy that token. And now I need to create that token inside of Bildr as a secret. So the very next thing I want to go over is secrets, right? So again, back to what Drew did, we're basically just doing mappings for the header, for the data, for the URL. We're kind of just like tying it one-to-one back and forth. But for the authorization in particular, we're going to do something a little different. And the reason is security. So if you've got an API token from this third-party service, they've generated this token, you don't want anybody else having that token, because you probably get charged for every time it runs with your token, right? So you don't want other people having that token and using your token to run whatever it is. So you want to keep that secret. So in Bildr, we allow you to create what are called secrets, and then you can map those into your API requests. So if you look here, I have this header. The name is authorization, and the value, rather than being like a text value type, like maybe text here, I've chosen secrets. And inside of that, I selected the secret that I want. If I go to manage project secrets, you can go here, or on the left side of the screen, it's right here on the left, you can go to secrets, and that's going to pull up your list of secrets. So you might have one or more of these for every for different API actions in your project. Like some of my projects, I have like 5 or 6 of these. So if I open Screenly, secret, excuse me, I can reveal the value here. It's hidden, and I don't mind if everybody sees this, but you typically don't want to show your API keys like this. But for this, it's like a trial thing, it's a test thing, it's fine. But note that here, I'm actually telling it to be bearer and then space the API key. And that's really important. If you just put the API key, it won't work. And the reason is, if we go back to the documentation and we look at it, it's saying header is authorization, bearer space your token, right? So you want to be really conscious of how it's asking for that information. A lot of times it's bearer, sometimes it's not. It can be something else, but most of the time it is. So I created that secret value, and then I selected the secret value here. Now what's going to happen on our side, on the Bildr side, when you run that API call, rather than just sending it in JavaScript, that API key will never be shown in JavaScript. It'll never actually come to the client browser session. No one will ever see that. But on our backend, when we send it out, we're going to actually send it out with the actual API key. All right, and I can answer any questions over if there's any. That's kind of like one of the topics that I know people get hung up on. If there's any questions, Cora, on that, I can stop and go over that, or we can keep going.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's any questions so far. Emmanuel asked if secrets are shareable across projects. They're not, but you can copy paste.
Yeah, just copy paste them across projects. And I do that. I'll have one API and I use it across a bunch of different projects. Actually, like me and Dorian and Drew, Michael, we all share because you already got something set up and you're not really using it like full blast in production or something. You're just trying stuff out. Everybody's helping each other out. We use it that way a lot. No big deal. I left the body empty here because this API in particular does not need a body. It doesn't care for it. Same thing with handle response. I'm doing the exact same thing that Drew's doing there, where I'm setting it to a variable called API response. setting the status code, and then running some success actions. Okay. Now this, I wanted to show this because there's two different ways. I actually did what Drew said. Like there's one way is you run them inside of these things. Another way is you can just run actions right after it. It's like, I could have put a switch condition here or a conditional action that said if it's a 201 or 200 or whatever it is, then do this, otherwise do this other thing. Or you can actually just run actions at the end. So this, I'm literally assuming I'm always going to get a success message. That's what this is assuming, because at the end of the API call, whether it's success or fail, I'm running this thing, right? But usually you want to get a little better than that in production. You want to go and say, if it's this status code, then do these things, set the value in this way, and so forth. But for this, I wanted to show all the different options. So, so on success, I run a thing. On error, I run a thing. And then either way, I set the value of that variable. If you remember the API response variable, I'm setting that into this image element that's hidden back here. It's actually hidden on the screen, but I'm setting that into there. But notice this path here. I know it might be hard to see. There's a path inside of it. So what I did is I went and looked at their documentation. If I go look at their endpoints, there's usually going to be something called request, which will show you all the things you can send to it, all these different options that I can send to it. And then there's going to be something called response. Sometimes it's in a tab like this. Sometimes it's just below or to the side, but that's what you're looking for, is request and response. And on the response, if you notice here, there's an object around the whole thing. And then there's the first step, which is data. And what I really want is this screenshot URL, right? So I want this value right here as the image, because that's what it's going to produce. Okay. Now, in my case, I'm not setting many options. So like I could have set file type and gotten a PDF or something. I'm just letting it respond, which is going to give me a PNG. So I don't care about it. So that means if it's PNG, I can just set it right into an image element. So if we note top level object, data, URL, if I go back into the action, and actually they actually, this is the thing I was kind of saying, they actually accept shot URL, URL, and screenshot URL all as options in there. And shot URL is actually not even in the documentation. I just happened to leave it in there. I found it in another piece of documentation they had. So 0.data, 0 means first object, data was the first name that was in there, and then shot URL was the next thing that was in there. So I'm saying, get me the first object, .data, .shot URL. So it's going to take that response from the API call that I set into the variable. Then it's going to actually parse into that JSON. Bildr parses into it using this path, pulls out just the piece I want, and sets that into the image. So if you look in the elements tab here, you can see there's a div inside of here. There's a Lottie animation, and there's actually a hidden image. It's like behind the Lottie. It's actually display none right now. So I set the value in there, and then on success, I hide the Lottie. I show the response. I set the response message, and I concatenated that together saying success. And then here's the response code, and pull the response code from a variable. And then I show the image. So if we go back and look at that demo again, it ran all this. If I click it, it hides the message, processing. When the API response comes back, what it's actually doing is it sets that variable. Then it takes the variable value, goes through it, and it looks like there's something in their thing that only works every other time or something. I don't know. And then it sends it back through using that dot notation, sets it into the image. I hide the Lottie, I show the image, and now you're seeing this instead of the Lottie processing file. All right, so basically what I did is I just went to a totally custom API. This API is not in Zapier. It's not anywhere other than in this documentation. And I can just use that generic API action to call it, no problem. Now it does take some work because it totally depends on that API. So yeah, before I dive into what I did is I wanted to make this one a little simpler for Screenly because I really liked the output of this API, but I didn't like that it was sort of not documented very well. So I went and created a custom action, API action for it. But before I go into that, Cora, should I go over any questions, or do you have anything I should bring up before then?
Yeah, so does anyone have any questions on maybe like the page structure or how we generally did this? So this first example, you used the regular API action, right?
Yeah.
To kind of do this. And
Yep.
then based on some of the stuff he found, he's going to show us how he created a custom action for this that should make it a little bit easier to integrate. We do have one question from Fred. He wants to know if we can show him the path on the Screenly doc.
Yeah, let me go into there. So it's actually going to be a JSON typically. So in the response, this is showing in their documentation, when I hit this shots endpoint, the URL of the API, there's this response, and it's going to show me, it says that what this is saying is that I'm going to get a response code of 201. And then I'm going to get all of this information about it. So the dot notation, what it does is it allows me to step into each part of this JSON text, right? So there's this JSON here. I've got the top level thing, which is always 0 if it's an object. And then the next thing was data. So if I wanted, say I wanted to get usage limit, right? I could have gone meta, instead of .data, I would go .meta, and then .usage limit, and then .usage, and that would return a value of 15. So what this is saying is I'm actually in like a trial for Screenly, and they allow 1,000 requests per month. And every time I do one, and it's actually returning as part of the response, how many more I have remaining, right? So I've used 15, I've got 985 left, and it's going to reset on this date, which I think is wrong because that says May 1st or something. So that's not right. But yeah, you get the idea. Now, one other thing to note in Screenly here, they actually delete the images off of their server after an hour. So if you actually wanted to keep this image, you would need to like save the image. You could use our image uploader to do it. Instead of setting it into an image itself, set it into the image uploader and set that to save into a field just like you would any other image uploader, and it would work fine. Because this is only going to be valid for an hour or so. I think their dates are obviously wrong here, but I did test this, and I actually was not able to access an image that I had created like a couple hours before. It was gone. So yeah, the way we want to find that, you're going to look for the response. They are not going to call it a path typically. They're not going to show you dot notation in order to get there. That's general understanding of JSON. And if you're going to go down and work in APIs, I would highly recommend getting familiar with JSON. And I don't know of any like great resources out there for it, but we could go over any details. Like if you jump into that Discord and just ask about any JSON questions that you have, it's pretty straightforward. There aren't that many variations to it. That's why it's a kind of a standard now, is because there's really just arrays, objects, and properties, and that's pretty much the extent of it. There's a little more to it, but that's pretty much how it's used. And so you have this object, which is that curly bracket. You have properties, which can contain other objects or other arrays of objects. So an array of objects is basically a list of objects. And then inside of there, you have another property, and then there's a value. So key value, like Drew was saying, is property : value. So key value across back and forth. And you can use dot notation, which is the text dot text dot text dot text is going to step down into each layer of this. So dot data, dot URL, and so forth, until you get to the thing you're looking for. So there is no standard, specific dot notation, but it's more of like, this is a specification for how JSON operates, and you can use dot notation to step into it. It's called parsing into the JSON, basically.
Okay, awesome. So I think Fred got that. And then no other questions. Peter just shared a great resource, and I will copy that for the visualization of JSON. So that could be helpful for anyone who's learning APIs. So what are you going to show us now, Mark?
Yeah, I just wanted to show, especially for any developers in the room, especially if you're answering questions in the community and you want to help anyone out with API actions. I know Projo, when it went through, he made a really great doc on creating custom action types and functions. So I'm going to get a little bit into that depth here, but I'm not going to go super deep. But when I looked at this API in particular, I don't write like JavaScript or anything, but I understand JSON, and I've worked with APIs enough to where I can kind of see where all the problems are. But like in this one, I couldn't figure it out. I had to get with Dorian and be like, hey, how does this work? And we actually pulled a developer on the call, like a coder on the call. Like, how does this work? Dorian ended up figuring it out. But so, I want to like be really clear here. If you're not a coder, you can get like super deep into these things and really go far without it, including creating custom action types if you want to. If you're a coder, you'll probably get this pretty quick. But basically what I did was I went into the action types area over here on the left, and I searched for API, and I went and duplicated the standard API call action. Okay, so I just duplicated that action type. And then that created, when I named it Screenly API call. And when I went in there, I knew I don't need a body, right? Because it doesn't want a body, it wants the URL parameters. It doesn't need, like I know that it's always going to be post method. So I can remove that and make it static to just always be post. So basically I can go in there and customize the inputs, and it doesn't make APIs like unbelievably less complex or anything, but it does remove some of the question marks. Excuse me. So like for one thing, I could have actually removed the URL and just statically put that as well, but I decided not to. And then in the URL parameters, I left those because you need to have full access to them. But note, there's no body, there's no method, there's none of that. I just statically set all of that into the action type so that when someone uses the Screenly API call, there's just less for them to think about while they're doing it. And then the really important piece that I did here was, instead of having set it in an element or set it in a variable, I actually just said set it into an element, just to keep it like super simple here. Because you can also do a get out of an element, just like you can do a get out of a variable. And most of the time when someone's wanting to use a really straightforward API call, they just want to take the output and do what it's intended to do, which in this case is show the response, show whatever that image was that was created. So in the action type, I actually did that dot notation inside of the action type rather than doing it here. So the user doesn't have to think about .0.data .shot URL or whatever it's called. All they care about is what element am I setting this into. So for instance, if I changed this and said, put this into maybe the URL text, so it's going to go into this URL text here. And then let me change the button to use the custom one. Okay. So now instead of setting it into the image, and instead of using that other API, it's going to use my custom API action instead. Note that it set it up here, right? So now I can see, and it already had this in here, so it showed it and it was still there. But basically the idea is I can now manipulate that action type, that API action type, to do whatever I want to do specifically for that. So this is really important if you're working with in a team, especially like if you're working with people, some people really understand APIs, some people don't. There's something consistently that you're going to be doing. We're happy to do some of these too. Like I enjoy actually doing custom action types because I think they can help a lot of people, not just with APIs, but with all kinds of action types. It just simplifies things, right? And I can go into any level of depth you guys want to go in on the custom action types. It's not really what the call is too much about, but I wanted to point out that you can do this kind of thing. Makes it easier for people to find that action type, makes it easier for people to use it. But I'm happy to go into any level of depth that we want to dive into there. What do you think, Cora?
Yeah, so I want to zoom out a little bit and just call out two things while we're giving everyone maybe a chance to see if they have any questions. All right, so what you did to create this is you went and you duplicated the generic API action that we have in there. And then you essentially just modified that duplicated action to be your own thing. And it looks like you uploaded a nice logo for Screenly.
Yep.
Gave it a Screenly name, etc. So that's one thing, is like, you can always take anything that we have in there and make it your own by doing that. And then the second thing is, because you just gloss over it so easily, is that you went in there and you swapped out the action to use your custom
Oh, yeah,
thing.
back
You
here.
went to your preview and you didn't refresh, you didn't even do anything, you just clicked the button and
Yeah.
it ran the new action. So that's resonance. That to me is always the coolest thing. It's like magic. I don't, that's the way
Yeah.
that I see it, is that when you're making changes, you don't have to come in here and refresh. Like, you just see it and you test it right away, so you stay in the flow. I think that's important to note. You don't have to go save something or anything like that. So if you're
Totally.
wondering kind of
And
how that works.
one thing I would note there too is that when you go in, like even if you come in here, like let's say I went in here and I said, let's go to the Screenly one. If I came in here and modified the action type, or I said, okay, okay, it's using the HTTP call function. So let me go to the JavaScript function. We go here and we open the function. And if I make a change to the JavaScript itself, that also gets pushed in real time out to all sessions of the dev environment. Not of, like, if you're in if you have a published production environment, it's not going to automatically push to that. You got to publish to that. But for your live view, it's pushing even the JavaScript functions out there. So if you're writing the code and you're modifying that code, you still don't even have to refresh. You can just go back over there and click the button and try it again and see if you've got a different result that you had before.
All right, so we do have a really good question that I wanted to touch on, and Emmanuel is asking, how do you share a custom action type for others to use, review, or learn from? And I know we
Yeah.
have some things in work, so maybe, I don't know if there's a manual way we can show now and then talk
Yeah.
about what we have in the works.
Yeah, so right now, the easiest way to do that is actually to create a pattern and share it with someone, which actually there is a Screenly API pattern now. So you can actually import this into your project and you'll get a workspace just like this one. And I actually go through a good bit of this in this short video on the left, just showing you how to use the action and what to fill out, where the documentation is, that kind of thing. But the fastest way to share an action like this is actually to do it through a pattern right now. Now, the way that we do it is a little different. When you go into a flow, so I'll just go into this flow and I click on add action, you can see if I type API, you can see there's now this Screenly API call. Well, actually it's this one. This is my custom one that I had created. And this is the one that shows up for everyone now. So we already have a way internally to literally just click a button that sends this up to this list to say this is now available for everyone. So that same method, we will be offering that for everyone, not necessarily to get it into everyone's lists, but to share it to your profile, which then has a copy and pastable code that anyone can bring that into their project just as an action. So that way you don't have to bring in a full pattern with a page and all these things. But for now, what you want to do is create a page, put a flow on it, put the action inside the flow, create a pattern out of the workspace and share the pattern with someone. And then they can import that pattern and they should be good to go. They'll have the action in their project after they import the pattern.
Okay. Real quick, how do you create a pattern? Go to the workspace,
Yep.
like create your stuff, go to the workspace. If you hover over the workspace on the workspace and page menu, you'll have a link that's create pattern, and then it'll bring all the pages from that workspace, any custom elements you have, custom actions, all your design and styling. Turn it into a pattern, gives you a link, and then you can share that with anyone. When they import the pattern, they get all of that into a workspace in whatever project they import it from.
Yep. So when you share a pattern, it's going to show you the workspace that you selected. And if you select the wrong one, you can just select another one. But what you're going to do when you come here, fill out the details. So add a pattern image, change the name of, this is going to come from your workspace name, give it a description, give it some tags if you want. And then after you create the pattern, you'll have an option to add that to your profile. So if you actually go my profile, if I go view profile, so my profile, excuse me. My laptop is taking off right now, so sorry. But my profile actually has a bunch of things on it. Like it's got the Builder project as a project template and all those kind of things. I call it the one that started them all. It's the Builder one. And then there's like some micro-SaaS projects that I've done, a landing page template I did a long time ago, the job board, and the screenshot, Screenly API pattern. And if you're us, you can actually mark this as featured. You guys won't have that.
But you are not us, so you cannot do that.
So when we mark it as featured, that's what makes it show up in the patterns list for everyone. But we will actually be making these kind of options available for everyone. So you can see how quickly this turns into a marketplace, how quickly it turns into easily shareable things. So it's coming. It's really close. We already have the structure is there now. Everything's ready to go, and we actually already kind of use it that way. We just like click the button and share it, and we can actually republish out changes to these actions and things from our different projects. So like Drew has a set, Michael has a set, Dorian has a set, I have a set, and we maintain our own actions that you all use in your projects. And so it's really dynamic and, like many to many relationship on all these things.
Yeah. So in the meantime, if you do have build something really cool to share, do that, create it into a pattern, and you can put it on your profile if you want people to be able to see it. And then, we'll bring shareables. So it does look like we have hit an hour, but I think we probably have a little bit more time for more questions.
Sure.
And Mark, I wasn't sure if maybe you wanted to do talk about what you're working on with Metamask. I know there's some new actions in everyone's project.
Yeah, if there's no other questions on APIs, I can kind of just do a really quick high level. I don't know who all in the room is like super into Web3 or NFTs or any of that kind of good stuff. But we're kind of seeing it as there already is a large trend going into Web3, has been for a while. There's some good evidence that that's going to continue in a really strong way over time. So we want to kind of get ahead of the curve and offer some things. I think realistically, Web3 is going to be, a decade or more before it's like the way to do things, because it's a massive change taking place. You kind of have to change the underpinning of all apps. And that's not a realistic thing to do in a short period of time, right? But there's sort of I don't know who coined it. I actually heard it yesterday for the first time. This idea of like Web 2.5, right? So Web 2.0 is, you've got these APIs going back and forth. You have data in a centralized database. You have standard authentication methods and mechanisms. And Web 2.5 is saying we're going to use tools like Metamask to do our authentication. We're going to store data on the blockchain. We're going to use smart contracts as our function calls instead of a centralized app service, that kind of thing. So there's this like, Web 2.0 is here, Web 3.0 is like way over here. Web 2.5 is sort of merging the two together in different ways. So the first way that we're going about that is to do full native authentication using Metamask, which is probably the most popular crypto wallet that's out there. And it's pretty straightforward if you know what you're looking at, but I don't know who else in the room who actually knows what you're looking at. And to be honest, I actually started learning about this stuff like 3 weeks ago. It's so interesting that we just like started diving in big time. Now Drew's been in it for, I don't know, 7 years or something ridiculous.
Maybe not like that long.
6 years, I don't know, long time. Longer than most of the people that I know. But yeah, I'll show real quick. We're in the process of building our MetaMask auth. I think I have Brave open over here. Yeah. So I've got this MetaMask auth and I can do like get wallets. And so this pulls up my MetaMask wallet. And basically what I'm doing is it went into MetaMask and I said, yep, I want to grant access. And it gave me my wallet address. So this is sort of like step one in, if you want to do like Web3 or NFTs, this is like step one is your wallet address. Let me go into MetaMask. I'm actually going to remove the site. Let's go remove that site, disconnect. And then the second one, So the get wallets is like, let me just get the wallet ID. The second one is actually signing in with it. So step one is, let me get the wallet ID. But step two is, now let me go to the server and sign in. And this is sort of like where we're at. We'll have this done like in the next release. This is coming out, but I can't really show it any more than that. But basically what it does is it goes and creates this like unique value on the server side, brings that back, and then sends that back over to your wallet to get signed. And when it does that signature, that's how we know that you are who you say you are, right? Not just that like you went and found this person's wallet ID. And what's really cool about that is that we can do things like, I can check in your wallet in the app to see if you own a certain amount of a certain cryptocurrency. And if you do, then I can grant you access to certain information inside of a project or certain pages of a project or things like that. And so it's this blending of like Web3 auth and checking your cryptocurrencies, checking if you have certain NFTs, checking what you have in your wallet, that kind of thing. And then granting sort of like Web 2.0 style access to things. And I know this is like some of this stuff, if you're not into it, it's like, right? But if you're into it and you know what you're seeing here, it's kind of a big deal because you're able to get all the pieces. You can sort of like build a full app, web app, the way that you would normally build a web app, but you can integrate with the cryptocurrency and the Web3 infrastructure that's out there in the world. And Drew, I don't know if you want to like mention anything else that we're doing there. There's a ton that we're rolling through on this. That's sort of like the super first part that you have to get right before the rest of it can come out. But yeah.
Yeah, I think there's the one thing that's everyone forgets right now, because we're in like hyper NFT times where you can do all these interaction with smart contracts, all this really exciting technical stuff with Web3. The other side of that is you can send payments with no central party. So you can send Ethereum through Metamask to someone, and you don't have to have a PayPal account. Doesn't matter if your country restricts Stripe. It doesn't matter about any of this stuff in the Web 2.0 world. You can actually just, they're authenticating with MetaMask. That's how they prove that they're who they say they are, that they own that wallet. And you can just accept money as an application to yourself. You can have two parties using your app, send money to each other, things like that. So there's a whole, that side of it too, which was that's kind of like the simple side, weirdly, because it does, Ethereum is crazy, and the crypto side of computing in Web3 is crazy. It does a lot more, but those are kind of the basics that we're stepping into right now.
Yeah, I totally glossed over that 100%. Yeah. It's like, you can do really cool stuff like, pay this amount of Ethereum and you get access now. And one way I can give you that access is I can give you an NFT that's in your wallet. And then every time you come in to log in, I can check to see if you've got that NFT in your wallet. And if you do, great, you get access to the SaaS application that I built, or to the community that I built, or to whatever. Or I can create my own coin and see that you hold a certain amount of that and grant you access if you do, and then you can buy the coin in order to get in, right? And so it removes a lot of sort of like infrastructural barriers that are existing in the world today because of, society built the way we built it, right? We built it with banks and we built it with a certain infrastructure and all that. It's just how commerce works. And decentralization sort of like flips all that on its head. There's no gatekeeper anymore. And I think a really good point, Drew, that you brought up there is, we get it all the time. Stripe doesn't work everywhere, right? It just doesn't work everywhere. So you can't always use Stripe in every country, even though if you're in, the US, or if you're in parts of Europe, you're like, oh yeah, just use Stripe. But there's a lot of the world that doesn't get to use Stripe and doesn't have a common way to accept payment. And this solves a lot of that. So it's really exciting.
It's all
Corey,
way too cool for me.
Do you want me
But
to
I am
answer those
excited
questions?
to send this recording to John McConnell. Yes, we've got David's questions, and then I want to go back up to Probjobs because he's asking about something that I would like the answer to. And that is documentation with an explanation of the Bobby helper functions.
Yeah, we need to make that documentation. I'm sorry about that. We absolutely need to create that documentation. Unfortunately, there's not, but we are happy to help. If you dive into there and you need anything before we get those docs out, definitely reach out, even, just go into, and the best way to do it is in Discord right now. But if you've got something that you think will benefit the community at large, or being public with it, be great to put that into a community post, and we can do some detailed responses there. And then of course, when we get our documentation out, we'll launch that out. That Boppy helper, if you are a programmer, if you're a JavaScript developer, there's a set of APIs that we have in Bildr. It's called the Bildr API, which is Boppy. And inside of there's a file called, it's the model, right, Dorian? Boppy.model, right? In Boppy.model, if you go in there and you look, there's a set of methods. I don't know how many now. It's a lot of methods in there. Doing things like, finding the element on the certain element node on the page, or, how to set variables, or even like doing external authentication. So the way it's structured, a lot of the custom actions we use, like the Metamask action that we created just like in the last couple of days, the real sign in auth action, actually just uses a bunch of Boppy implementations that are inside of there. And so it's a really powerful set of helper functions. If you know JavaScript and you're into it, it can help a ton. And if you have questions, reach out. Me, Dorian, Drew, Michael, we've all got some experience with it. And of course, we've got a team of developers who wrote it, and we can get you the answers you need. But we're happy to help with anything.
The other thing you can do real quick if you want is you can just, if you want to do something, say you're like, how do I run an action with a Boppy helper? You can just like find another function that runs an action, look at the JavaScript and you see it. And actually, like that's how I learned all Boppy helpers. I've never seen documentation on them. I actually, to be fair, maybe like 1 or 2 times I might have asked one of the devs like a question. But really, when I want to know how to do something, I'm like, how do I run an action? Oh, the run action on page function runs an action. I go into it, I see that line, I paste it into my own function. It's pretty easy to do it that way, actually.
It's like our own internal Stack Overflow without, it's like.
But yes, Prep Joe, we need this documentation, and I really, really want to get, we have like an old version of it, but it's just has not been updated with
it's too out of date now.
Yeah. So, but I'm gonna add that to the feature request list that I look longingly at every week. And then, okay, so I hope that answers that. And then yes, just ask us, because we'll go make a video or show you how to do or explain something if there's ever anything in particular. David's questions, Marco?
Yeah.
Do you want to take a
So the managed data collections is coming in the next release. So as soon as we get our next production release out, it's like weeks, not months. Like we're getting pretty close now. I really want to get the MetaMask stuff in there. So we're really close on that. And there's some other UI tweaks and things. There's actually a lot of updates in this one again. Not just like this kind of stuff. There's a ton of updates. And so, yeah, it's coming, and I've already got it. Like we use it internally already. Me and Dorian and Drew and Michael are already like using it. So, and then the plan to expose native collection APIs. Yes, that's also coming, not in this next release, but it is coming. It's high on our priority list for the roadmap. It's not something we take lightly. We have built these type of APIs before for previous versions of Bildr before we spun it out and reworked it as a product. So it's not like it's brand new to us. We know exactly how to implement it. I mean, the previous versions of our ability to create API endpoints for collections in our previous versions, you could do things like you would expect there, where you say, I want to pre-filter, I want to create an endpoint, and then I want to pre-filter that endpoint based on these things. It's like only allow access to these columns, only allow access to this data that matches this pre-filtered set of data. And then I want to either manually create API keys there for users or for a purpose, or I want to allow dynamically generated API keys, and also click this button and here's a PDF of the documentation for whatever endpoint you just created. Right, so that's the style that you're going to get whenever we get there. And obviously, that's a ton of UI UX work in addition to the backend security things that go on there, where you're starting to expose things. But done it before, no reason we won't do it again. So I think that's similar to the number 2 and 3. I wasn't sure if there was a difference. Maybe Drew, did you read that any different than I did
But yeah, it's like you covered it, I think, like creating, and like in Xano, you create your own custom endpoints that
Right.
are pre-filtered or whatever you want to do with them. And it gets pretty, I mean, like amazingly specific. You can go deep with that. So yeah, that's definitely the style that we want to do also.
Yeah, for sure. And
And it
Dorian
might come
actually
out in
uses them.
stages, right, guys? Like we might do just the very first version of this that just allows access to the builder data, and then kind of like add on some more. Or are you imagining that it's going to come out with all of the stuff?
We'll see. Yeah, it's hard to say. But we want this internally too. There's a bunch of stuff that we
Yeah.
want to do to allow you guys to do things, not just for your own projects, but like in the studio, and sending things to your project, and attaching things to other media files, stuff like that. Or things like being able to do use GitHub for the functions, right? That kind of thing, and pushing and pulling and all that kind of stuff. So we have a lot of use cases for getting the APIs correctly built on top of the collection. So it's coming. It's high priority for us. I think it's probably the last thing in Builder that we have to say no to. I'm pretty sure it's the last thing where someone asks a question and we say, no, there's no way to do that thing. And technically there is always a way, like, but you got to hack around stuff and it's not any fun.
And we
So-
don't like saying no, so that
Right.
makes it high on the priority list. And actually, we did a vote on this, I think several Builder hours ago, where we were like, hey, these are the big things that we're thinking about. And it seemed like modifying data and having like a really nice UI around that was number one. So that's what we ended up doing. And then the API thing was really high. I think that might have been like number 2 or number 3. So yeah, we'll definitely do the things that you guys that would help you all be successful and help you build apps you're wanting to build.
Sure.
Okay,
All right.
I think we are all good. Anything else? No. Okay.
That's it, everybody. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for sharing the awesome resources, y'all. I will post a recording of this to the community and in the Builder YouTube channel, and I'll include links to everything everyone shared. And then Mark, is that Screenly pattern curated?
Yeah, it's up there. It's ready to go.
Cool. So you guys can import that into your projects from the patterns list if you are interested in checking that out. Otherwise, thank you so much, and I hope you'll have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.